In past centuries, doctors treated grave illnesses with bloodletting because they believed that they were removing the cause of the illness, when all they were actually doing was weakening the patient's resistance to the disease. Someone who seeks to relieve suffering without knowing the cause of suffering can themselves become the cause of more suffering. Moreover, maybe believing that something is inevitable, like suffering, can see it become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Or maybe it just sees us work within realistic limits. A disturbing example of the self-fulfilling prophecy idea is the example of a Muslim mother learning that her son was preparing to become a suicide bomber. She might not try to dissuade him, but decide that, since her son was going to suffer whatever he did with his life, he might as well suffer in a way which brought honour to their family. When John Humphrys asked Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi in Great Britain, how anyone who has seen his or her child suffer and die, how then they could go on and manage to hold on to their faith, Sacks replied, "To my mind, faith lies in the question. If you didn't have faith, you wouldn't ask the question. If I did not believe in a just and law-abiding God, I would not find injustice and human suffering worthy of question whatsoever. After all, the universe, if it has no God, is utterly indifferent to any question. It would be so blind to my hopes and indifferent to my prayers. So, if I have no faith, I cannot ask the question. Faith is in the question." John Humphrys stopped Rabbi Sacks at that point and said, "I have to say that if a politician said that to me, that's a most difficult question. If I give you an answer, it will destroy your faith in the political system, in the democratic process. So it's very important that that question not be answered." I'd think he was having me on. He's right. How can we examine ideas if we do not ask questions about them? Even or perhaps especially if we do not believe that the idea relates to anything real. Saying that faith is in the question is nothing but an attempt to bamboozle the faithful and silence the critics. What was John Humphrys' response to Rabbi Sacks' answers and to those of Professor Ramadan and the Archbishop of Canterbury? At the end of all those interviews, it was, "It won't do." What the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rabbi Sacks and Professor Ramadan were all trying to do, with their sometimes convoluted, sometimes almost hapless, yet always sincere answers, was to grapple with the concept of theodicy, to answer the question, how can God be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, as the three Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam say that God is? As we become more aware of the presence of more and more evil in the world, this stance is becoming more and more difficult to maintain. Theologians, ministers, imams, rabbis, and lay people around the world have had to wrestle with these questions, and several new fields of theology have developed in response to the conundrum. Perhaps the most comprehensive and confronting of these has been the Holocaust theology. Holocaust theology is a body of theological and philosophical debate, mainly Jewish but also Christian, that attempts to come to terms with the various conflicting views about the role of God in this world and the events of the European Holocaust that occurred during World War II, when around 11 million people, including 6 million Jews, were subjected to genocide by the Nazis. A central question of Holocaust theology sets forth many questions, but the central question is, how can people still have any kind of faith after the Holocaust? There have been many responses, of course. At one extreme, there is one of the many orthodox positions, which I find even unpleasant to state, that Jewish people in Europe were sinful, or their guilt had been accumulated, and within this view the Holocaust is seen as a just retribution from God. It is, of course, an extreme view. At the other end of the spectrum of Holocaust theology is the position taken by Professor Richard Rubinstein that the only intellectually honest response to the Holocaust is the rejection of God altogether and the recognition that existence is ultimately meaningless. In between these two extremes are many other positions, and one of these is the idea of the hiding of God's countenance. Like an eclipse of the sun, God is always present, but sometimes his or her presence is obscured or hidden, only to re-emerge later. Within this position, the Holocaust is seen as an instance of the temporary eclipse of God. There are times, these theologians say, when God is inexplicably absent from history. There is a biblical source for this, they say, in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 18, where God is said to have said, "I will hide my face on that day." Theologians within this position say that this statement was given in response to the rebelliousness of people, where man abandons God and so God abandons man. Here, instead of the open punishment of humankind by God that other theologies might offer, the hiding of the countenance of God abandons the people to natural laws and historical processes. Other theologians, like Rabbi Harold Kushner and the Christian Holocaust theologian Jürgen Moltmann, speak of a far more limited and suffering God. Post-Holocaust, Rabbi Kushner and others believe in a limited God. They believe that God is not all-powerful and is therefore not to blame for humankind's abuse of free will. So for them, there is no contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of massive evil by sections of humankind. The answer to where was God in the concentration camps, these theologians say, is crying his heart broken like the rest of us. The Christian Holocaust theologian Jürgen Moltmann says that the traditional notion of God as an impassive, unmoved mover died in those concentration camps, to be replaced by what he calls the crucified God, who is a suffering and protesting God. He or she is a God who is not detached from suffering, but willingly enters into human suffering in compassion. Moltmann's God, post-Holocaust, opposes the evils of the world by entering into pain. Moltmann's theology of the crucified God was developed much later into the liberation theologies that were so popular in Stalinist Europe and the military dictatorships of South America and South Korea. The theology of Jürgen Moltmann was very popular when I was at Ministry College in Manchester, and my liberal Methodist, Baptist and United Reform colleagues all wrote papers on Moltmann and put his work to practice in the many socially and economically deprived areas of Manchester. The questions I would like to ask each of you and ask of myself are, how far are the responses of each of these Holocaust theologians and the responses of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Professor Ramadan, and the Chief Rabbi of Great Britain, how far are they sophisticated, nuanced responses to complex and demanding questions, and how far are they desperate, maybe ridiculous attempts to hold on to faiths that should have been let go of long ago? And as Unitarians, when faced with suffering as grave as speaking with a mother whose child is dying, how far do we want to refer to a God who punishes the wicked? Do we want to speak of a God who is there, but who is temporarily eclipsed, whose face is turned away from us? Do we want to acknowledge a God who is limited and who suffers with us and sits with us? Do we, like the Archbishop, focus our attention on the good of those helping and supporting us in our suffering? Do we, like the Muslim scholar Professor Ramadan, accept that suffering is our lot and work together to accept its symptoms, yet accept that we can never explain the reason for its presence? Or do we, like the Chief Rabbi, resist from ever asking that question, because that will put our faith in question? Or do we respond to all these explanations like the journalist John Humphreys and say, it won't do? Amen.